Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, the first in our series of Adapting in 2020. I'd love to welcome you all. Now, first, a couple of housekeeping things is in your chat box. I'd love you, if you want, to let us know where you're joining us from. It's just write your name and where you're dialing in from, and just be sure to change your to panelists and attendees. So if you want to start just jotting in where you're from and what you're maybe potentially looking to get out of this. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands from which we're all meeting today, because unlike our usual events where we're in the one spot, we're all dialing in from different lands. So I'd like to acknowledge the custodians from all the lands of which we're dialing in from and we're meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And fantastic, we've got people coming from Bendigo, Benalla, William Anglis, Sydney. Fantastic, welcome everyone. So my name's Georgie. I am the Chief Engagement Officer at Fetching Events and Communications, and I'm thrilled to bring you this webinar. It's the first in a series of webinars we're going to be running through this strange and changing time that we're in. And it's really about how we adapt in 2020, and not only adapting to the COVID crisis, but adapting to the, I guess, economic situation that we'll probably find ourselves in coming out of this. So welcome everyone. Just a couple of other housekeeping. This is being recorded, so just to keep that in mind. So just move on to the next slide. So things that we'll cover today, and I'll pop off the screen shortly so you can just concentrate on the slides. But what I'll be going through today is a little bit about myself and Fetching Events. We're going to look at why people volunteer. And in order for us to engage effectively, it's really important for us to understand why people volunteer in the first place and what their motivation is. We'll then look at the current state and the sentiment and the mood that that people are feeling at the moment, and how that may affect our existing volunteers as well as volunteers that we may look to engage with in the future. And we're going to sort of flip it on its head. Usually I would start with how to recruit, and engagement would start at the recruitment phase. But for this one, we're actually going to look at engaging with our existing volunteers first, and then we'll talk through some recruitment and retention strategies for this time. So a little bit about me. I have over 20 years experience in the community and volunteer sector. And I've trained anything from large teams at the Sydney Olympics to the Melbourne Commonwealth Games, right down to managing volunteer teams at Make-A-Wish Foundation, at the National Trust. I've worked at working horse festivals, worked with community clubs, so everything and anything in between. And importantly, for me, it's about authentic engagement. It's not about just us filling roles and filling rosters with bodies, but it's actually how we engage with our volunteer workforce to really create a strengthened workforce, a workforce that feels really valued, and of course then a workforce that will love what they're doing and really will see the benefits and the rewards in that from the type of work that they do. So for me, it's really important to be a volunteer myself, because I always think to be a good volunteer manager or a good volunteer leader, it's important that we volunteer and understand what it's like from the other side. So I'm in the CWA branch of Port Phillip. I volunteer in a homework volunteer program, which of course has been ceased because schools aren't running, and the library that we volunteer in has closed. So I'm certainly experiencing what it's like to not be able to fulfill my weekly volunteer role. I volunteered in a pet visit program, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later, because it really does talk to engagement and how we engage and work with our volunteers authentically. I've also been on a board and committee, so I've seen all sorts of roles that a volunteer does, and I've understood firsthand what it's like in that journey. So we will get started, and what I'll do is just dive into the screens now. So what I wanted to do first of all is to run a poll, and I'm just going to launch that now. So if you just want to have a vote of what the current volunteer engagement challenges are that you're facing. So have your programs been suspended due to COVID, and perhaps there's no current roles for your volunteers to do? Or are you needing to recruit volunteers during COVID due to increase in your services? Some of your volunteer programs might be running and some aren't, so you might have a real hybrid of your volunteer workforce. Perhaps you've had to adapt programs. Your volunteer resources have probably been reduced, seeing some of that come in, and certainly an uncertainty of volunteer programs and when they'll resume. So I'll give you just a couple more moments to cast your vote in that. Okay, so I'm just going to share those results. So we've got, which is probably no surprise, that programs, one of the challenges is programs have been suspended due to COVID and that there's no current roles for volunteers, and then the uncertainty of when those programs will resume. And none of us have a crystal ball. Certainly none of the futurists or people that are looking at the trends from previous past similar situations have a crystal ball. So first of all, I want to say I don't necessarily have all the answers of what we're going to look like on the other side, but what we can do is look at previous situations that have been similar and start to piece together what it might look like when we come out and what we can be doing to really strengthen our engagement. So what I'll talk to is very much around that, how we can engage at the moment, and then I'll do a little bit about recruitment when we come out the other side, because which I'll talk about in a moment, I anticipate we might be inundated with volunteer applications as we come out of this. So the first thing I want to touch on and just remind us is why people volunteer and really understanding our volunteer team. And it's good for us to just remember what the term volunteering is. So from Volunteering Australia, volunteering is time willingly given for the common good and without financial gain. And of course, in that we have formal volunteering, which is probably what most of you are involved in, and we have informal volunteering. And informal volunteering really refers to that community volunteering that isn't captured or recorded. So it could be looking after a family member. It could be running errands for a disadvantaged or an elderly person down the street that can't go to the supermarket. So we will see those terms formal and informal volunteering throughout the webinar, and it's just good for us to remind ourselves what they refer to. So I've just thought it would be good for us to go back to the State of Volunteering, which was a report that Volunteering Australia put together in 2016, and some of you may be really familiar with this. If not, it is a really good and easy read that you can just Google. So it's State of Volunteering, Volunteering Australia, where they worked with a large audit house and did a large review of the volunteer sector, not only interviewing volunteers, but also volunteer managers. And not that these will be necessarily surprises to you, but it's just some good reminders, because if we can understand why people volunteer, we can understand how to engage with them. So 93% of volunteers saw positive changes as a result of their volunteering efforts. And if you've ever done stuff with National Volunteer Week in the past, you will have seen, you know, give happy, live happy, and all the benefits that come out of volunteering. 77% of informal volunteers were motivated to informally volunteers to support those in the community. And we'll come about how important the community will be shortly. And 60% of volunteers improved their patient skills through volunteering. So I'm sure if we scratch the surface, we'd actually see a lot of informal volunteering happening at the moment. So neighbours doing shopping for neighbours that can't get to the supermarket, people doing shopping and buying supplies for essential workers who can't necessarily get to the shops because of their shifts. So they're already, and we've read about it in the news, and we've certainly seen probably elements of it firsthand, even within our local community, that people are wanting to make a difference. and they're very much community focused. So through the report, they found that volunteers are inspired to be involved in volunteering as it allows them to give back to the community. So as I said, we're seeing that already. Volunteers are motivated to volunteer by a personal belief in a cause or issue, and volunteers are driven to make a difference. One of the questions they asked volunteers is what motivated them to be involved in volunteering, and touched on this already, but to give something back to the community. And that's really important to remember as we go through this, because community out of this situation is going to become more and more important, and localised communities are going to become more and more important. Their personal belief in a cause or issue, to make a difference, which we've talked about those that summary, to gain skills and experience, perhaps an existing relationship with the organisation, learn new things, fun, social connection. But it really is that motivation to give back and to make a difference. Volunteers were also asked how their organisation could improve their experience, and it's pleasing to see that the majority said nothing. But, and this is probably no surprise for most of us who manage volunteers, it's always a shortage of volunteers, or often a shortage of volunteers, so recruit more volunteers. And that's a really interesting one too, because sometimes there actually isn't a need for more volunteers, but volunteers feel there's not enough help for them. And so their immediate reaction is, we need other people to help. More training and professional development opportunities, and just keep that one in mind because that's a key engagement element that we'll talk about. Feedback, I'd like to receive more feedback. Better recognition of the value of my volunteer role, and we'll talk about reward and recognition shortly. But a key thing on that is there's often a thought that volunteers want reward. You know, they want a gift, or they want something to reward them for their volunteering, but they actually just want recognition. So a simple thank you, a simple thank you card, a simple message from, you know, the CEO, and we'll talk about that a bit later, can be just as powerful, if not more powerful. So we've looked at why people volunteer, and I thought this might be a good time to have a think about why people volunteer in your organisation. So and you're welcome to put them in the chat box, but really think, why is it that people came to your organisation, or the particular roles that you offer, and what was that key motivator for them? Because once again, when we understand that, we can understand our engagement better. So feel free to jot those down in the chat box if you'd like. Perhaps I'll give you my experience first, is that the volunteer program that I volunteer in with the Homework Club I was that typical person in January a couple of years ago where I thought I'd like to volunteer. What can I do? And I actually went on Go Volunteer to have a look at what opportunities they had, and I looked at a whole range and realised I actually want to volunteer close to home. I want to volunteer in a community where I can see I'm giving back a difference. Okay, so we've looked at why people volunteer. The next key thing for us to look at is what's happening at the current time. And this is probably no surprise, and this could be something that you're feeling yourself. But the current mood and the current feelings that people are having, people are feeling isolated, uncertain, yet hopeful, stressed, but optimistic, anxious, yet motivated, but also frustrated. And what we'll find as we go through the next 3, 6, 12, you know, however many months, is that people will all have different experiences and they'll go through them at different times. So what we need to consider when we're engaging with our volunteers is to really adapt our messaging depending on what's going on. And a lot of talk in regards to the current situation, people are actually looking at the 5 stages of grief and loss, which is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So for some people, it is a grief process, and they may be working through those. You may be working through these yourselves. But there are, within those feelings, you know, we've got hopefulness, we've got optimism, and we've got motivation. So while people are feeling very disconnected, and I'm sure we've all read about that, and feeling very isolated and uncertain, and certainly, you know, our volunteer programs are uncertain, but there is a level of optimism and motivation that we can tap into as well. So not only will each person go through this, you know, we'll go through different stages, but each demographic will go through different stages. So that's something for us just to keep in mind as well. There's two distinct groups feeling the most impacted, and there's a lot of talk, and for any Gen Xers like myself who are on this call, there's a lot of talk that Gen Xers are the ones really squeezed in the middle, and will potentially carry the load on this. But two distinct groups feeling most impacted are in the 30s and 40s, young families, small business owners. There's also a lot of talk about a social recession because we have lost that connection. And while we can do webinars like this, and we can do Zooms and house parties and FaceTime, it doesn't give us that social connection that we crave and that we come together for. So that is something that we'll really watch. And that's something where volunteering can really fill the gap on that. And the longer we go without human interaction, the deeper the impact. So at the moment, people are looking for connection. They're looking for safety. They're looking for helpful and supportive environments. And you'll find the more we go through this, you might find that these all really match your organisations. And I personally think that community organisations will be some of the strongest that will come out of this, because our focus will turn more localised to our communities, and the focus will be wanting to make a difference. So that connection, that safety, that helpfulness, that supportiveness. What will people want? So we know they're isolated, but they're motivated, they're disconnected, but they're optimistic. So what will they want to do? And in fact, some of them, what are they wanting to do now? They're wanting to make a difference. They'll be wanting to do self-improvement, and a lot of that's happening at the moment. And by you being on this webinar is you know, an example of that. They're going to be really focused on meaning. What things give them meaning? And this, you might find you're doing this yourself, is people are using this as a time of reflection to really find out and look at what's important to them. And this will all come out of this. You know, we can look at the way that frontline workers are being valued. So perhaps positions that we've taken for granted before, but people are really being valued for the actual contribution they're making. From nurses, you know, all our healthcare workers, doctors, paramedics, to, you know, our people stacking the shelves at the supermarket, to delivery drivers. So people who are actually making a contribution are now being a lot more valued than they've ever been. So people want to make a difference because they're also valuing people that make a difference. And our view is changing on who we value. Now, how far that continues out of this, no one knows, but it's certainly a strong sentiment at the moment. Self-improvement, focus on meaning and learning. So people will want that human connection. It'll be localised, and this will partly be forced because when restrictions start to ease, we anticipate it will start at a local level. Neighbourhoods are becoming a lot more important because at the moment, that's all we've got. We're only for the majority of us, we are only in our neighbourhoods and communities. So that is really what people will be craving coming out of this. So the trends, there will be a trend towards a much leaner life coming out of this, a more focused life, a more considered life, and a life with more purpose. Now, we've talked about the reason people get into volunteering is because they want to make a difference, they believe in a cause, and we look at people coming out of this will want more purpose. I anticipate we could have a real surge in volunteering, which will have its ups and downsides. So just another time for reflection is to start to think how your volunteers are feeling and the different experiences that they're going through at the moment. And you may have got this from emails, you may be chatting with them on the phone, it may be with some of the volunteers that are still working, and feel free to pop them in the chat box. And I can tell, I'll talk about a program that I'm in, not the Homies, but another program where I only started volunteering actually in January. So I went through the whole recruitment process. I've done one shift. And when the stage 2 restrictions came in, I got a fantastic email from the organisation that was really open about what was going on. They talked about how much they value their staff and their workforce. So the volunteer workforce was really included with all the other key stakeholders, which I was so impressed with. We then got another email and they told us what they're doing during the current time. We then got another email when the programs that they ran needed to cease because of social distancing. And once again, it was a terrific email. It talked about the value of us to them. It talked about what they're doing. It was really honest and open and transparent. And I've heard nothing since. And I can pretty much anticipate that the next email I'll get is when the program will restart and I'll be required again. And you can imagine that disconnect that I'm already feeling, that I was really valued at the start and then they've forgotten about me. Now, it might not be that they've forgotten about me, but it's really that they feel they've given me, you know, an update and that they don't need to give another update until they've actually got something to tell me. But this isn't enough for us. We need to keep people engaged. And if we I'm just going to go through some of what people are, yep, it's a trying time to engage volunteers in other ways, absolutely. And still giving meaning to their contribution, and that's a really important one, and we'll talk about that a bit later. It's not giving people things to do just for the sake of it and to look like we're keeping them occupied or to look like we need their help. Because if we get them to, you know, do the history, perhaps of a local historical area, and we can say, you know, this is a good time to do some archiving, and then nothing happens with that history, that's going to create a huge disconnect. It's so important, Emma, absolutely, to keep people engaged. So, which moves us on to engaging in 2020. And the first thing I'll say is that it's not necessarily throwing out what we've been doing. We should be engaging anyway. This is just building on this. And it's creating an engagement that will last out of this crisis. So we also don't want to look like we suddenly have upped our engagement during COVID or during, you know, the economic situation that we'll have that'll come out of that. And then it drops off again when we go back to business as usual, or whatever that will look like. So this is really about making a strong program that we can continue through. And Kate has mentioned volunteers are missing each other, absolutely. And in the tourism industry, and that's it. We're not sure how long it will take to continue. And we'll talk about a few things as we go through. So the first thing I thought I'd talk about for me, when it's usually business as usual, what's important for engagement is structure and training. We know from research that volunteers do want structure and they do want training. They do want position descriptions. They do, you know, want code of conduct because it creates a safe environment for them where there's a shared expectation from both them and the organisation they're joining up with of what's expected. Responsibility. You know, they do want to be involved. They do want some sort of responsibility. And I always come back to a study that was done with a group of people building Lego, and you may have heard about this. So there were two groups of people that were tasked with building amazing Lego structures. Now, the first group would build their Lego structures and then they would be placed on the windowsill on display. The second group would build their structure and then dismantle them. Now, you know, you can guess which group actually took more pride in their Lego structures. Was the one that had them put on display. So when people understand and have that responsibility, rather than just giving sort of meaningless or little ad hoc tasks, they'll engage more. Reward and recognition, we've talked about, and obviously communication. So that's when it's business as usual. But what does business as unusual look like? So for me, these are the four key things at the moment: is communication, value, involvement, and connection. When we go through these, also think about the different roles, because you may actually need to engage differently depending on the volunteer role that you're working with. And as I said, this isn't just about now, this is about creating a program that will really take us forward and show that we're committed, whether we're in a crisis or outside of a crisis. The other thing is I'm going to give you a range of tips that you can use, but it's about what's realistic for you as well. Certainly not saying you need to do all of them. We don't need to create this whole new strategy, but it's about what little things can we do that will make a huge difference to our volunteer team. And I actually don't like the word volunteer because I think it generalizes. We're just talking about people, you know, at the end of the day, it's just people that we want to show value to and we want to connect with. So communication. The simple biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And I'm sure we've been in this situation before where we've thought we've told people, but we haven't. So email updates, really important. They don't need to be long. They don't necessarily need to tell them a whole lot of new news. It can actually just be checking in on them. Be honest with them. Say at the moment we're still, you know, there isn't a set date to return and we'll be guided by the authorities or the, you know, official advice that we're given. But if you just hear from people, you're automatically engaged. And what does that do? It builds up your loyalty and it makes you want to work better and you know, longer for this organisation. So email updates, regular contact, keep in that regular contact. You might decide that every Tuesday afternoon or every Tuesday fortnight, you send out an email. So your volunteer group know that I'll get a communication at this time each week. Give them service updates. Now, this might be about updates that are happening in your organisation that won't necessarily impact on their role, but it still keeps them included in the organisation. They are part of your workforce. So make sure that they're updated on everything that's going on. Honesty. Don't try and guess what's going to happen. Be honest with them and treat them with that respect, and they'll really respond to that. Don't let them be the last to find out. And this is a key one because sometimes we're focused on the roles that the volunteers are doing, the people, our workforce, and we're giving them updates about those programs, but we actually forget to update them about other things that are going on in the organisation. And then they read about it on Facebook or they see it you know, on Instagram, and it could be a fantastic thing that the organisation's doing, or it might be a tweak or an announcement that the CEO's put out, and they've heard it secondhand. You know, so make sure that they're not the last to know on things. And as I said, this is really building that relationship for the future. So that first one is around communication. Value. Employees, or we'll say volunteers, need to feel valued, safe and heard before they can be engaged. Once again, this is not a surprise, but sometimes we just need to go back to basics. So we know why people volunteer. It's around giving back. It's about being involved in their community. So when we talk about value and when we show the value to them, we need to tie it back into that. Now, this could be as simple as a video from the CEO, a video that the CEO has filmed on their phone saying, "We miss you. We can't wait for you to come back." The contribution that our volunteer workforce has made at this organisation for the last 25 years is invaluable. And we can't wait to see you all walk back in the door, because if the difference you make to this community is immense. It can be really simple like that. It could be a simple video from the CEO at home saying, "Hello from my home to your home. We miss you." So it doesn't need to be some big budget thing. It doesn't need to be high cost. It can actually be as simple as that. And it's personal, because at the moment, people are feeling isolated, they're feeling disconnected. So something personal will go even further. Do you have ambassadors? So you might have celebrity ambassadors or sports or service ambassadors with your organisation. Can they do a thank you? Because what this does, it not only shows to your volunteers the value that they make and how much the organisation values them, it also involves your ambassador. And let's not forget, when we talk about volunteers, we're talking about potentially ambassadors that do work for your organisation, committee members, board members. So there's a whole range. What about a video from a service user? So maybe some of your programs are still running, but your volunteers aren't able to be involved because of social distancing. But could you get a video or a message, or even just a quote from some of your service users about how much they miss them, how much they can't wait to see them. Now, that's assuming our programs do come back. I know we need to take into account some uncertainty there, but just a simple thing like that can really make a difference. It also, it brings everyone back to the same level, because our volunteers, our workforce are at home, I'm at home. But if I get a message from the CEO of an organisation I volunteer with and he's at home, it's like, you know what, we're actually all in this. So it can be really simple things like that. A lot of organisations are doing some great things by taking this time to feature their volunteers. You know, we kind of talk about the upside of the downtime is that we do get a chance to do things like that. So if you feature your volunteers, maybe in your Facebook page, or maybe, you know, you start a little get to know each other and feature a volunteer in an e-news or a simple email each week, not only will the volunteer that's been featured feel valued, it will show all the other people in your workforce how much you value the work that they do. Training opportunities. So we've talked about people crave training, and particularly at the moment, everyone's thirsty for knowledge, because, you know, we're stuck at home, the majority of us, not everyone, but the majority of us. We potentially are still working as hard, but we kind of have lost all our other engagements that we do, and we want to keep active. Is look at different training opportunities. And I guess for me, one of the upsides of this time, if you could find one, is there's a lot of free training content that's out there. And people are really willing to give away information and training programs. So maybe you can tap into providing them some training. And what I'll say also at this point is provide options, because what one of your workforce want to do because of how they're feeling won't necessarily be what another wants to do. So don't just think I'll send emails or I'll do a video from a CEO. Try different things so you actually give people the opportunity and the choice in how they want to be engaged with during this time. And thankfully, we've got a fantastic engagement opportunity for National Volunteer Week coming up, which is Monday the 18th to Sunday the 24th of May. And if you head to Volunteering Australia's website, there's certainly lots of resources there. So this is actually fantastic timing in a way, because we can clearly show the value of our volunteers and acknowledge them during this time. You won't be able to come together, which maybe you have in the past, but that doesn't mean you can't engage. You might have a Zoom drop-in morning tea where people can come on board. You may actually ring, depending on how many volunteers you've got, just ring a volunteer, you know, ring your volunteers during National Volunteer Week and say, I just want to say to you, thank you for all the work you do, and recognise you, particularly during National Volunteer Week. The other thing is digital's not going to replace, obviously, human interaction. And in fact, I think we'll go the other way when we'll come out of this, is that people will consume and you know, really crave that human connection. So we don't always have to FaceTime. We don't always have to get people on a Zoom. An old-fashioned phone call can go a long way. And in fact, you might have some members who aren't on email anyway. So for them, a phone call is something that they can come together for. Involvement. Tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn. So key ways to really involve them. And there's some fantastic stuff happening at the moment. I was chatting with Lord Summers Camp and Powerhouse, organisation that run a lot of camps. So all their programs are in person, you know, live camps and services and programs. And they've quickly had to adapt them to run an abridged version, we'll sort of say online, while, you know, our social distancing restrictions are in place. And I interviewed the CEO, and it's available on my website, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I interviewed the CEO and I said, how did you manage to change and adapt and rework your programs so quickly and bring them online? And his answer was, our volunteers. So instead of just the office admins, or not, I shouldn't say admin staff, but the office staff and the program managers designing them, they actually got their volunteers who are involved in those programs when they're camps or in-person services, and they got them involved to help design how they would run online. So you can imagine how engaged those volunteers will now be because they were asked to be part of the design process. So think about, are there any ways that you can involve your volunteers to be part of that? Ask them for their input. Ask them what they want to be doing. You know, you might even send out a little questionnaire. I certainly know with our CWA, at the start, we started saying we could do this and this, and we realised actually we're completely overwhelming. And we're actually going way off the reason people volunteer with the CWA. We were trying to solve the world's problems rather than go back to basics of why people were part of this community club. So we actually did a simple survey. What would you like during this time? Regular meetings. So we always meet on a Tuesday night. Those meetings have continued. We just do them online. We have a laugh, we keep it fun. We know not everyone's going to dial in correctly at the start, but we keep it lighthearted. And what that also does is it keeps that routine. And during this time, sometimes the best thing that can anchor us in some sort of normality is keeping some of that routine we've had. So we keep our meetings at a minimum, same as we just run them online. But then we asked what else did people want? Rather than assume what they want, we actually asked for their input. Also think about what can people do from home. You know, are there projects that you've been wanting to do? I know of historical societies and community groups that have a long list of people they've wanted to interview for years to do some archiving. Could you actually do that from home, you know, interviewing someone over Zoom, recording it? So are there things in your backlog that you can actually start to put together that can be done from home and that obviously still fit within sort of your guidelines of volunteering? Things you've been putting off in the past, start to think about those. But it's really important that, and we talked about this a little earlier, that they are authentic and they're meaningful projects or involvement. And I'm not sure how many of you, and you can pop it in the chat box if you've heard this urban myth of the painting room at a hospital in Melbourne, where every few months they would get a call from a corporate group saying, we've got some corporate volunteers ready to volunteer and help. And of course, you know, the hospital can't just jump into action. So they would say, sure, we've got a room that needs to be painted. So the volunteers would come in and they would paint the room and they'd feel very proud and that they'd made a difference, and they'd go off. And the next corporate group would ring. What happens? They get sent into the same room. We need this room painted. And it was only when a return group realised we've already painted this room that they realised what was happening. So it does need to be authentic and it does need to be meaningful. And it does need to come back to why people volunteer with you. Because what's happening at the moment, people are trying to solve, as I said, the world's problems, and they're actually forgetting to just keep it simple and keep it back to the purpose why people have been involved with you. Connection. The smallest act of kindness is worth more than the grandest intention. So make it fun. You know, this doesn't have to be dry. We can actually do some fun stuff. As I said, offer different platforms for connection. And I'm not a big fan of the word platform because it sounds so technical, but maybe it's a phone call, maybe it's an email, maybe it's a post on Facebook, or maybe it's a Zoom meeting. Personal phone calls can go so far, you know, just that really old-fashioned checking in. I certainly know if I got a phone call from any of the programs I was working on, I would suddenly sit up, puff my chest out and feel very proud and valued. Online catch-ups, you know, can you do Zoom ones? What about sending a postcard? And I've certainly done this because basically we're all on a staycation. I went and bought a whole lot of Melbourne postcards because I'm based in Melbourne, and I'm sending them out to people because at the moment we're just sitting in our houses. A lot of us are either looking at devices or we're reading a book or we're watching television. But what about, let's go back to some old-fashioned and really authentic engagement. What if you sent during National Volunteer Week and once again, depends on your numbers, I certainly acknowledge that, but a handwritten thank you card or a handwritten postcard that says, we can't wait to see you again, or we hope you're doing okay, and really make it personal. Because if you went out to the letterbox and you got that and it's such a surprise rather than just another email, imagine how far that will go to really tie that connection and that engagement with your workforce to your organisation. And as I said, adapt as the situation changes, because it does keep changing. And messaging that you sent out maybe 3 weeks ago will be different to messaging you'll send out now, which will be different to messaging that you send out in the next 4 weeks or 6 weeks. So we do need to keep adapting it. And you might even put, you know, we'll send you an email every Tuesday afternoon just to keep you updated on what's happening. And then this quote ties back into all of this. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And it really is in this time of how people are made to feel. And it's not that they'll necessarily abandon you if they don't hear from you, but their loyalty might suddenly go somewhere else because that organisation engages with them better. And I talk about it often from a communications thing of, you know, don't be that fair weather friend. So don't be that friend that drops out during the hard times and then comes back during the good times. And often we don't mean to, but we feel, oh, we've got nothing to tell them, or we can't update them with anything. But sometimes it can just be as simple as checking in on them, human to human. So we talked about how people are feeling. They're feeling isolated, they're feeling disconnected, yet there is some optimism and they're motivated. We've looked at why people volunteer, and we know that's because they want to make a connection, they want to give back to the community, or they believe in a cause. And we know that coming out of the sentiment is that people will be looking for a more meaningful life. They'll be looking for purpose. It'll be a lot more localised. And they'll really be around that meaningfulness and that purpose and that community level. Combine all that together and we could see a lot of volunteer recruitment happening and I guess volunteer engagement. So I thought, just with the time, I might just flick over the next few slides, which is just some things for us to keep in mind when we come out of this, if we do have an influx of people wanting to volunteer. And feel free to put in the chat box if you're finding that at the moment. And certainly know when we have a crisis like bushfires or floods that organisations are inundated with volunteer offers. Certainly soup kitchens and food services get inundated at Christmas by people wanting to volunteer on Christmas Day. But what we want is people, to create an engagement with us and that will actually be there for the long term. Might just be for a year, might be 2 years, but can your program sustain an influx of people for a month or 2 months? Some might, certainly, food banks and those kind of organisations are needing an influx of volunteers, and they might not necessarily stay, but your organisations might be looking for that longer term commitment. And this is a time that people will be wanting to do something great. And it goes back to that people are feeling hopeful and they're feeling motivated, and they're feeling optimistic. So what will they be wanting to do? So this is just a little reminder for us when we're recruiting and it comes back to engagement, hire an attitude, not just experience and qualification. So before you start recruiting, start to think about and I should say, not only before you start to recruit, but if you do get, if you're starting to get, or you do get a lot of volunteer offers and inquiries, go back to your basics. Do you need more volunteers? And if you do, what are the number of roles? What are the position descriptions? What are the actual skills and experiences you need? And what's the target number? Because we all know when we're short of people in our volunteer workforce, that it's very tempting to just, potentially take on anyone who offers, which is the worst place to start with recruitment. And I'm always reminded when people say to me in volunteer training, how do I deal with a difficult volunteer? And my answer is at the recruitment stage. Because if we don't recruit right, then that's when we start to have problems. And if we need to suddenly recruit a whole lot of people, or we're suddenly inundated with volunteer offers, then we sometimes can lose sight of getting back to basics of what our programs need. Identify the best time to recruit. This is more if we, aren't inundated, but there's just some things after an event, board terms, recruitment drives, word of mouth, referrals. And this is actually talking about boards. Boards can often be hard to recruit for, but I actually anticipate that this will be a great time because people will be wanting to make a difference. And you'll particularly have people that will want to use their skills in a certain way. And that's where boards could do quite well out of this. So let's think that you may be inundated, or you find you come out of this and your programs are still running, and that you need to recruit more people. Start to think about, when you get these applications, does their availability meet yours? You know, is your availability flexible? Skills and experience, understanding of the role, motivation, and that's a key one, is what is that motivation? Are they just, is it their New Year's resolution, or are they really committed? What added value will they bring? What's their commitment? What's the position description criteria? And are they a good fit for the organisation? Where to recruit? Newsletters, notice boards, open days. The next one is really key, and this goes back to all the engagement that we talk about, is existing volunteers. We know it's much easier to nurture and look after our existing volunteer base or membership base or sponsorship base during a time like this than try and grow it from scratch. So not only do we want to engage with our volunteers so that they stay on with us, hopefully, if our services still run. So not only do we build that engagement so they stay with us, they feel loyal to us because we've valued them and we've built that strong relationship, and they feel a commitment, you know, a two-way commitment between them and the organisation. But they tell their friends, and they are our best referral channel. So if we look after our volunteer workforce, they'll stay and they'll tell other people that this is a great place to volunteer. So never forget the insights and the value as a referral stream that those volunteers can make, rather than trying to recruit from scratch if you're short of volunteers. And then obviously we've got social media and online, and Go Volunteer, which can be a great one. And I anticipate there'll be a bit of a boost on Go Volunteer after this, just like there is in January each year. And then externally. So we look at, you know, these are just some simple ideas of local media, event programs, community clubs, volunteer centres, TAFEs and schools, particularly for different types of volunteering. And certainly when I need event volunteers or more sort of ad hoc volunteers, that they might not be able to give the commitment for a long program, but they'll fit a short-term program. Or a skills-based program. When I say that, I mean that a marketing student comes and does some marketing work for us, that they can be really good. So we've talked about why people volunteer, what's happening at the moment, what we need to do to engage them. And then we've talked about potentially we could be inundated with volunteer applications, or we may need to recruit a whole lot of volunteers. And so we start to go, we need to get that retention right. And that retention really starts with the recruitment. It's the ad that's been advertised, match the role. And I mentioned earlier that I used to volunteer for a pet program. And I think it was one of the most enlightening experiences as a volunteer, because it really showed where there can often be a disconnect. And the recruitment process, and this was to take my dog to nursing homes, and the recruitment process was that we needed to do a test, myself and the dog. It's very exhausting. That they needed to know the dog was quite well behaved, and that the dog could, you know, put up with strange smells or different surfaces, or people just sort of reaching their hand out and hitting him on the head, or, you know, because obviously mobility may be limited in the nursing home. So we went through this whole recruitment process. It was a full day, this test and briefing. It was fantastic. I was so impressed with everything about this program. We were then told what our next steps would be. So our next steps would be that we would be assigned a nursing home, and we would be given a roster, and we would go to the nursing home on that day, and there would be a book to sign into, and then there would be a badge that we would need to wear, obviously, in a nursing home, and then there would be someone that would take us around. So I thought, this is fantastic. So the dog and I, Jack, hopped in the car and off we went for our first shift. We were so excited. We had told everyone about this, and we get there. No one knows who we are. No one's ever heard of the program. There's certainly no book or no badge, and there's certainly no one to take us around because the staff are flat out just doing their own job. And suddenly there was a huge disconnect from the really well-meaning recruitment and admin and training side to what actually happened on the ground. So really think about, do your two elements match? And I can say Jack and I lasted a couple of, I think we lasted about 6 visits. And then we just, you know, we were so disengaged and that we just didn't continue. So it was a really classic, you know, example of where two things can be so disconnected. Rosters, are they realistic? Training, so do the volunteers feel supported? And we've certainly talked about the training that we can do during this time. Communication, we've talked about that. Have you kept in touch with your volunteers? Recognition, have you thanked your volunteers? So even though they might not be doing anything now, are we still thanking them as we go? So that's a little snapshot of what's going on and what we can be doing. Change is coming, and we don't necessarily know how big it will be or how long it will last, but there is certainly a train of thought that there will be social change coming through this. And that can actually also be an exciting thing because it gives us time to look at the programs we've been running, look at how we've been engaging. Could we be doing it differently? Have we actually asked our volunteers about how we've been engaging with them? You know, this is a perfect time to actually do a survey with them so we can actually get their insights. And as I said, it's the upside of the downturn. But I want to leave with this quote before we move into questions is, whatever you do, do it well. Do it so well that when people see you do it, they will want to come back and see you do it again. And they will want to bring others and show them how well you do what you do. So if we engage well, and if our volunteers love what they see, and then they want to bring more people to see it because we do it so well. And that's a really great thing to remember, because this is around how we can engage, how we can build that loyalty and continue that loyalty. And as I said, it's not just about through the crisis. This is long term, how we show value and how we really nurture those existing volunteers, because the last thing we want to do is, you know, in 2 months or a month's time or 3 months' time or 6 months' time is say, right, we're ready, welcome back. It's too late, we've lost them, you know, and that would be a real shame. So now we can move into questions, and I hope that's given you all some tips to go away with, and feel free to put questions in the chat box. And I can see one here from Kate. Do you have some tips about how to take this opportunity to not invite all volunteers back? Maybe time to suggest retirement from volunteer roles for some. Yeah, Kate, this is a really tricky one, and it happens at all sorts of times. What I would say is you can't not invite volunteers back, but you can start to look at how you could transition them into another role. And it would depend on the reason that perhaps retirement is suitable for them. And sometimes it comes down to technicalities that our insurance will only cover volunteers up to a certain age. What I've often done in the past when we've sometimes had difficult volunteers, so I guess there's a couple of elements. There's volunteers that might be not able to fulfill the role they have been for whatever reason, and I've had ones with regards to being in a role where they're a judge and their eyesight was going. Now, thankfully, they came to that realisation and resigned from the role before we needed to go. There's other volunteers where we've realised that they've become a little difficult because they're not feeling valued, and perhaps the role they're in isn't the right role for them. So we've actually started to move them into a buddy system, and you'd be surprised how that can change behaviour. If they're a very toxic person, that's not the right thing to do. It may be sitting down with them and having a really open discussion. But what else could they do? So we've moved people into mentor roles. We've moved people who had a huge knowledge about the organisation but weren't really fit for that role, they actually became like an ambassador and a spokesperson, and they loved it and they engaged with it and they didn't feel like they were being pushed aside. So that's, you know, maybe some options you can look at. You might look at you know, rearranging some of your roles. But what I would say is if they volunteered before, they'll expect to come back. So you will need to be quite sensitive, but see if there's other ways they could be used. If there's you're talking retirement, so it might be more around age, but if it is around skill or behaviour, and hopefully you've got a code of conduct that you might talk them through with that. So I've got a question here from Emma. How do you feel about reaching out to volunteers existing to get them to help out in other ways? Absolutely. What I would say is give them the option. You know, that they don't feel like they're just being shifted to another role, but you could go to them and say, you know, while our programs aren't running, we've actually got some other work that we're working on and other opportunities. If you're interested in doing that, let us know, or have a chat to them. And it's about giving them the opportunity. And you know, we can all imagine a staff, if we were, although some of us probably are having this, but if we were just told to move to another role, as opposed to being given the offer and feel like we've signed up for it and then we're contributing more, that would be more the way to go. So certainly do reach out to them. Can we reach out to volunteers who usually volunteer physically to use? Absolutely. That's what I would say, is look, you know, I certainly know I volunteered in organisations where they actually, you know, I volunteered in a certain role. So at the Homework Club, I volunteer and I tutor my grade 5 student each week. We barely know anything about what we do in our other parts of our lives. Now, if they came to me and said, we're really stuck because, you know, we can't do this, but we can, how do we engage, or could we get some press for when we come back, which would get us more funding? I'd say, yeah, I'd love to use my skills to do that. So certainly give people that opportunity. What I will say is do make sure it's still within the guidelines of your volunteering, because what you don't want to do is get into any tricky things around your policies and procedures because you've stepped outside of that. So that's what I would say, just be wary of that. How do you feel about a public call out? Absolutely. Look, there's a lot of that happening, and you'd really shape it. Well, first of all, what I would say is before you do the public call out, you would go to your existing volunteers, because once again, we'd hate for them to be the last to know. And if I was looking on social media, or I read something in my local council news about my Homies program, and they were looking for someone to help them with marketing, my initial thing would, or volunteer management, my initial thing would be, hang on, you've got me in your program. So the first thing you would do is go to your volunteers, and then you could go to a public call out. But make sure that if you are bringing on new volunteers, you're still going through that same recruitment policies and procedures and code of conduct process that you usually would. Because remember, we will come out of this, and then you may have a group of volunteers who've come through, and you know, I mean, you can't do all your in-person training, but that have come through the process. And then you'll have this batch of volunteers that just were recruited, not only ad hoc, but the paperwork isn't, you know, consistent with everything else, and you start to get quite a messy program. So absolutely, you could do a public call out. And certainly at the moment, we've talked about people want to make a difference, but make sure it's still, you've got that framework for your volunteering. Any other questions? Before we go through, we've got a few more minutes, so feel free to send them in. What I did also want to let you know is some information about fetching events. So we specialise in engagement, and we do that through events, volunteer management and communications. And we mainly work with community groups, NGOs, not-for-profits, associations, local tourism, RSLs, local clubs, that kind of thing. So feel free to follow us on our social media channels. You can search for us on YouTube, and you'll actually find the interview there with Lord Summers Camp, which I talked about how they involve their volunteers in designing their program. And you can also visit our website, fetchingevents.com.au, and you can sign up to a regular newsletter that we send out. And we usually send that out once a month, but at the moment we're sending that out weekly because we find people are so thirsty for information. And we're also weekly, we're holding webinars. We'll be announcing our next webinar shortly, which will be around communications. And then the following week will be around events and when we think about community events. Not just festivals, but it might be, a local community conference or a volunteer recognition gathering. But and we're also interviewing. We have an insights interview series that, as I said, like our newsletter, we usually do once a month. But we know at the moment people are so thirsty for knowledge and are really keen to learn, and we're all doing that. That we're interviewing someone different each week. So the first week, and it's available on our YouTube channel, we interviewed the project manager from Clubs Tasmania. So they support local clubs, from football clubs to netball clubs to RSL clubs, and what clubs are doing at the moment to engage with their members, seeing they can't all come together. And obviously a lot of them, they're members of their volunteers as well. So that's a good video you might want to tune into. We'll be chatting, we chatted with Lord Summers Camp. Next week we'll be chatting with a business specialist on how businesses are moving. And the following week we're actually going to be chatting to a polio survivor, because we actually used to work with the Polio Network Victoria, and we're chatting to her from the aspect of having lived through an epidemic. How did it change her mindset, and what sort of things did she look for when she came out of it? Because we can, only learn from the past and get insights. So, as I said, if you've got any more questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me. And I'll pop my video back on so I can personally say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining me. It's wonderful to have people coming from around Australia and overseas and around our fantastic state here in Victoria. And as I said, we know that localisation and communities and giving back and purpose and meaning will be so important as we come out of this, and I'm really excited to see some of the great things that we can do. So good luck, all the best. As I said, stay tuned on our channels, and we hope you can join us at an upcoming webinar. Thank you and have a great weekend.